This is the story of Packard and Pierce-Arrow, two names that once meant more than any other in American automobiles. They represented wealth, prestige, and craftsmanship at a level that most people today cannot imagine. And they were destroyed not by competition, not by poor management, but by the greatest economic catastrophe the modern world had ever seen. Along the way, we will encounter visionary engineers, stubborn aristocrats, desperate gamblers, and a market that simply vanished overnight. So let us begin. But first, what exactly made these cars so special, and who were the people wealthy enough to buy them? To understand luxury automobiles in the early 20th century, you need to understand something fundamental about America at that time. The gap between rich and poor was staggering. I mean, truly staggering. We think we have wealth inequality today, and we do. But the Gilded Age and its aftermath created a class of Americans who lived like European royalty. These were the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Morgans, families whose wealth was measured not in millions but in hundreds of millions, and these people needed transportation that reflected their status. Now, in the early 1900s, automobiles were still a novelty. Most Americans had never ridden in one. But for the wealthy, cars represented something new and exciting, a way to demonstrate both their fortune and their taste for innovation. And this is where our story really begins. James Ward Packard was, by all accounts, a perfectionist. Born in 1863 in Warren, Ohio, he made his fortune manufacturing electrical equipment. But Packard had a passion for automobiles. In 1898, he purchased a Winton, one of the early American cars, and he hated it. The thing broke down constantly. When Packard complained to Alexander Winton himself, the manufacturer reportedly told him that if he thought he could do better, he should build his own car. So he did. The first Packard automobile rolled out of Warren, Ohio in 1899. And from the very beginning, James Ward Packard had one goal: build the finest automobile possible, regardless of cost. I mention this because that philosophy would define Packard for decades. It would make them legendary, and eventually it would contribute to their downfall. But we will get to that. The early Packards were remarkable machines. While other manufacturers cut corners and rushed products to market, Packard obsessed over every detail. The engines were more powerful, the materials were higher quality, the fit and finish were impeccable. By 1903, Packard had already established itself as the car for people who could afford the very best. That same year, a Packard completed the first transcontinental automobile journey. A man named Tom Fetch drove a Packard Model F from San Francisco to New York in just 61 days. This was extraordinary. The roads across America were barely roads at all. They were dirt paths, mud pits, and wilderness trails. Most people thought the journey was impossible, but that Packard made it, and suddenly everyone who was anyone wanted one. Now, around this same time, another company was establishing itself in Buffalo, New York. The George N. Pierce Company had been making bird cages and bicycles since the 1860s. Not exactly glamorous, but in 1901 they built their first automobile, and within a few years they would become Packard's only true rival for the title of America's finest car. The Pierce-Arrow, as it came to be known, was a different kind of luxury than Packard. If Packard represented engineering excellence, Pierce-Arrow represented pure, unapologetic extravagance. These cars were enormous, they were powerful, and they were beautiful in a way that few automobiles before or since have matched. The Pierce-Arrow's signature feature was its headlights, mounted directly into the fenders rather than attached to the body. This was revolutionary. It gave the cars a sleek, integrated look that was decades ahead of its time. But more than that, it became a status symbol. When you saw those fender-mounted headlights coming down the street, you knew exactly what you were looking at. and you knew exactly how much money the person driving it had. By 1910, both Packard and Pierce-Arrow had established themselves as the undisputed kings of American luxury automobiles. Packard had moved its operations to Detroit, the heart of the emerging auto industry. Pierce-Arrow remained in Buffalo, building each car essentially by hand. Both companies had waiting lists. Both could charge whatever they wanted. And both attracted the wealthiest and most powerful people in America. Here is where it gets fascinating. The customer lists for these companies read like a who's who of American history. Presidents drove them. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, all owned Pierce-Arrows. The White House itself had a fleet of them. Industrialists like Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie owned multiple Packards, movie stars, railroad barons, oil tycoons. Anyone with serious money and serious taste ended up in one of these two makes. And the cars themselves were absurdly luxurious. We are talking about hand-stitched leather interiors, wood trim from exotic hardwoods, crystal vases for fresh flowers. Some models had built-in vanities with mirrors and cosmetics cases. Others had speaking tubes, so passengers could communicate with the chauffeur. Because, of course, these people had chauffeurs. If you are enjoying this kind of deep dive into forgotten history, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow, and I have a lot more stories like this one. But anyway, back to our tale. The prices reflected this luxury. A basic Pierce-Arrow in 1912 cost around $4,000. That does not sound like much today, but consider this. The average American worker earned maybe $500 a year, an entire year. So a Pierce-Arrow cost 8 years of the average person's salary. The most expensive models could run $6,000 or $7,000. And Packard was similar. These were not cars for ordinary people. They were not even cars for successful people. They were cars for the truly wealthy. But here is the thing about catering exclusively to the rich. Your market is very, very small. In the best of times, only a few thousand Americans could afford a Packard or Pierce-Arrow. Both companies knew this. Both accepted it. They had no interest in building cheaper cars for the masses. That was Ford's business. That was Chevrolet's business. Packard and Pierce-Arrow built art. This philosophy worked brilliantly through the 1910s and 20s. America was booming, the stock market was soaring, and the wealthy were wealthier than ever. Packard sold over 50,000 cars in 1928. Pierce-Arrow was smaller, but consistently profitable. Both companies expanded their facilities. Both planned for a future of continued prosperity. They had no idea what was coming. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. The stock market did not just crash, it collapsed. Billions of dollars in wealth vanished in hours. Fortunes that had taken generations to build disappeared overnight. And this was just the beginning. I want you to imagine something. You are a Pierce-Arrow dealer in early 1930. Last year, you sold maybe 20 cars. Good money. Your customers were bankers, industrialists, old money families. Now those bankers are jumping out of windows. Those industrialists are watching their factories close. Those old money families are selling their mansions just to survive. Who exactly is going to buy a $7,000 automobile? Nobody. That is who. The Great Depression did not just hurt Packard and Pierce-Arrow. It devastated them. Their entire market, the narrow slice of extremely wealthy Americans, was either bankrupt or terrified. Even those who still had money were not about to flaunt it by driving around in an ostentatious luxury car. That would be tasteless. That would invite resentment. Better to keep a low profile. Sales collapsed. Pierce-Arrow sold over 10,000 cars in 1929. By 1932, they sold barely 2,000. And remember, these were expensive cars to build. The craftsmanship that made them special also made them costly to produce. You cannot build cars by hand at a profit when you're only selling a few hundred units. Packard fared slightly better, but only slightly. They had a larger company with more resources, but they were bleeding money just like Pierce-Arrow. Both companies faced the same terrible choice: either change everything about who they were or die. Pierce-Arrow chose to die with dignity. Well, that is not entirely fair. They tried to survive. They really did. In 1930, they introduced cheaper models, or at least cheaper by Pierce-Arrow standards. But here is the problem. A cheap Pierce-Arrow was still expensive compared to a Buick or a Chrysler. And it was not what people expected from the brand. Pierce-Arrow owners wanted exclusivity. They wanted to know that not just anyone could own what they owned. A cheaper Pierce-Arrow satisfied no one. The company changed hands multiple times during the early 30s. New owners promised turnarounds that never materialized. By 1934, Pierce-Arrow was in receivership. They limped along for a few more years, producing fewer and fewer cars. The last Pierce-Arrow rolled off the line in 1938. A company that had built cars for presidents, that had defined American luxury, that had seemed utterly permanent, was gone. Now, Packard's story is different, and this is where it gets complicated, because Packard made a choice that Pierce-Arrow refused to make. They went down market. In 1935, Packard introduced the 120. This was a smaller, cheaper Packard. It still had the Packard name, the Packard quality, but it was priced to compete with Buick and Chrysler. For around $1,000, middle-class Americans could finally own a Packard. And it worked. Commercially, the 120 was a massive success. Packard sold nearly 25,000 of them in the first year. The company was profitable again. The factories were busy. Jobs were saved. But something was lost. I mention this because the 120 created a problem that Packard never solved. The brand had meant something specific. It meant the absolute best. It meant exclusivity. It meant that if you drove a Packard, you were somebody. Now suddenly your dentist drove a Packard, your neighbor drove a Packard, the guy who sold insurance drove a Packard. The wealthy customers who had been Packard's foundation felt betrayed. Why pay $6,000 for a custom Packard when the same name sat on a car that cost $1,000? The prestige was diluted. The magic was gone. Packard kept building luxury cars alongside the cheaper models. They hoped to maintain both markets, but it was an impossible balancing act. The cheap cars subsidized the expensive ones, but they also undermined them. By the time World War II arrived, Packard was fundamentally a different company than it had been in 1928. The war itself provided a temporary reprieve. Packard built aircraft engines, marine engines, military vehicles. They were good at it. The engineering excellence that had made their cars legendary translated perfectly to military production. But when the war ended, Packard faced the same problem as before, only worse. The post-war market was different. America had changed. The old class distinctions were blurring. New money was flowing. And most importantly, the really wealthy had discovered European luxury. Rolls-Royce, Mercedes-Benz. These brands had the exclusivity that Packard had surrendered. Packard tried to compete. They built some genuinely excellent cars in the late 40s and early 50s. But the brand was tarnished. The cheap pre-war models had done their damage. When someone said Packard, people no longer thought of elegance and prestige. They thought of their uncle's car. They thought of the taxi fleet that had bought 120s back in '37. In 1954, Packard merged with Studebaker, a mass-market manufacturer. This was essentially an admission of defeat. The merger was supposed to create a stronger company, but instead, it created a weaker one. Studebaker was struggling too. Two drowning men do not save each other. The last true Packard was built in 1956. After that, there were a few more cars with the Packard name, but they were really just rebadged Studebakers, a sad ending for a proud name. By 1958, Packard was gone entirely. So what can we make of all this? Two companies that seemed invincible, that represented the very pinnacle of American achievement, destroyed within a generation. How does that happen? The easy answer is the Depression. And that is certainly true. The economic collapse of the 1930s was an extinction-level event for luxury goods manufacturers. But other luxury brands survived. Cadillac made it through. Lincoln made it through. Why not Packard and Pierce-Arrow? The difference was backing. Cadillac had General Motors. Lincoln had Ford. These were massive corporations with diverse product lines. When luxury sales collapsed, other divisions could absorb the losses. Packard and Pierce-Arrow were independent. They had no cushion. When their market disappeared, they had nothing to fall back on. But there is another factor, and this one is more interesting to me. Both companies were victims of their own excellence. They had built their entire identities around being the best. Not the best value, not the best for the money, the best, period. When circumstances forced them to compromise that standard, they lost what made them special. Pierce-Arrow refused to compromise and died quickly. Packard compromised, survived longer, but died slowly. It is hard to say which fate was worse, and what of the people involved in this story. James Ward Packard had left the company he founded back in 1915. He sold his shares and retired to Warren, Ohio, where he tinkered with inventions until his death in 1928. He never saw the Depression. He never saw what happened to the company that bore his name. Perhaps that was a mercy. George N. Pierce died even earlier, in 1910, long before his company's glory days were even over. He built bird cages and bicycles and eventually some of the finest automobiles in the world. Not a bad legacy. The workers at these factories scattered when the plants closed. Some found jobs at other automakers. Many did not. The Great Depression created a generation of displaced workers, and the collapse of the luxury car market contributed to that displacement. It is easy to romanticize these old automobiles, and I do, but we should remember that behind every closed factory were families who lost their livelihoods. The cars themselves became collector's items, of course. Today, a well-preserved Pierce-Arrow can sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Packards are similarly valuable. There is deep irony here. Cars that could not find buyers during the Depression are now worth more than houses. If only those original owners had held on to them. But of course they could not. They needed the money to survive. What strikes me most about this story is how quickly fortunes can change. In 1928, Packard and Pierce-Arrow seemed as permanent as the Rocky Mountains. Their customers were the richest people in America. Their products were unmatched. Their futures were assured. Within a decade, one was dead and the other was fatally wounded. We like to think that quality matters, that if you build the best product, success will follow. And sometimes that is true, but sometimes external forces are simply too powerful. No amount of craftsmanship could have saved Pierce-Arrow from the Depression. No amount of engineering excellence could have preserved Packard's prestige once they went down market. There is a lesson here, though I am not sure it is a comforting one. Excellence is no guarantee of survival. The best can be destroyed just as easily as the mediocre. What matters is not just what you build, but when you build it and what happens in the world around you. The golden age of American luxury automobiles lasted perhaps 30 years, from the early 1900s to the crash of '29. During that time, companies like Packard and Pierce-Arrow created machines of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. They represented an ideal of American craftsmanship that has rarely been equaled. And then they were gone. The factories that built Pierce-Arrows in Buffalo were torn down long ago. The Packard plant in Detroit still stands, a massive ruin on East Grand Boulevard. For decades it sat abandoned, a monument to past glory and present decay, Recently, there have been efforts to redevelop it, to turn it into something new. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps those old walls should house something alive again. But the cars themselves remain. In museums, in private collections, in the occasional concours d'élégance, where wealthy enthusiasts gather to admire mechanical beauty. When you see a 1928 Pierce-Arrow or a 1934 Packard 12, you are looking at the work of people who believed that automobiles could be art, who refused to cut corners, who built for the ages. They were right, in a way. Those cars have lasted longer than the companies that built them, longer than the fortunes that bought them, longer than the economic system that made them possible. They survive as testament to what American industry could achieve when money was no object and excellence was the only goal. Well, there we are. The story of Packard and Pierce-Arrow, two names that once sat at the very top of American industry, brought low by forces beyond their control. The Depression did not care how well they built their cars. It did not care about hand-stitched leather or exotic hardwoods. It just consumed everything in its path. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more. I love telling these kinds of stories, and there are so many more waiting to be told. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Take care, and I will see you in the next one.